When we think about America's drug crisis, we tend to picture a modern problem, right? A war fought on city streets against foreign cartels. But what if I told you the seeds of this whole crisis were actually sown way back in the 19th century? And what if the real enemy wasn't some foreign invader, but was actually a reflection in the mirror? Let's dig into the secret history of America's opium paradox. And this quote right here from historian Hans Derks just nails the paradox we're exploring. It's this idea that in America's big push for profit and power, it accidentally created a crisis that came right back to poison itself. It's the perfect story of a snake biting its own tail. So to really get how this all went down, we first have to tear apart a really persistent and, frankly, a very convenient myth about where addiction in America actually came from. This is where it gets really interesting. The common story, the one we've all kind of heard, frames opium as this foreign contamination, right? An Eastern vice brought over by immigrants. But the actual history shows something completely different. It was a homegrown problem with deep American roots, tangled up in American medicine, American business, and American government policy. Okay, so if it wasn't a foreign vice, who were the first Americans to get hooked on opium? Well, the answer is probably not who you're picturing. Believe it or not, the original face of American addiction was overwhelmingly white and often middle class. On one side, you had Civil War veterans dealing with just horrific injuries, and they were treated with powerful opium-based painkillers. And on the other, you had middle-class women using completely legal, widely available patent medicines and laudanum for, well, everything, from anxiety to menstrual cramps. This was seen as medicine, not a vice. 10 million. That's how many opium pills were handed out to the Union Army alone. The Civil War didn't just save the Union, it created what people later called an army of addicts. A huge population of people primed for dependence long before any stereotype of an opium den ever entered the public imagination. So the problem kicks off at home, fueled by war and medicine. But, and this is a huge but, at the exact same time, America's ambitions overseas were basically pouring gasoline on the fire. And it creates this incredible story of hypocrisy. While addiction was taking hold back home, American entrepreneurs were cashing in big time on the global opium trade. I mean, we're talking titans of industry like John Jacob Astor, using their super-fast clipper ships to smuggle Turkish opium into China, going head-to-head with the British. This wasn't some fringe operation. This was big business, making American companies some of the largest drug dealers on the China coast. Publicly, though, American officials were taking the high road. Here you've got a U.S. Governor General slamming British policy, saying that doping a population makes them more willing slaves. I mean, it sounds very righteous, a really clear moral stand against the evils of the opium trade. But was it genuine? No way, not even close. After the U.S. took the Philippines from Spain, it didn't shut down the colonial opium monopoly. It took it over. The U.S. government literally became a state-sponsored drug dealer, making huge amounts of money from the very same system it was condemning in public. And get this, under American control, opium use among Filipinos actually went up. So what do you do when you have a growing addiction problem at home and this completely hypocritical, profit-hungry policy abroad? Well, as the crisis got worse, American society found a very convenient target to blame for its own sins. I mean, just look at these numbers. Between 1871 and 1883, opium imports from the Pacific just exploded, from less than 40,000 pounds to over 220,000 pounds. And check out the duties, the taxes the U.S. government was collecting. This was an incredibly profitable business for the state itself. The government had a direct financial stake in the very trade it was about to demonize. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. This timeline is just chilling. Right as the opium imports and profits are peaking, what happens? The Chinese Exclusion Act gets passed. As the addiction problem, which was largely among white Americans, gets worse, the blame gets systematically shifted onto Chinese immigrants through racist laws and straight-up violent pogroms. And this whole thing was justified by the racist ideology of the Yellow Peril. Honestly, it was a masterpiece of misdirection. A domestic public health crisis, fueled by American doctors and businessmen, was successfully rebranded as a foreign racial threat. The image of the shadowy Chinese opium den completely replaced the reality of the middle-class woman using laudanum in her own living room. Now, of course, all this scapegoating didn't solve the problem. It just pushed it into the shadows.
And down there, in the dark, it morphed into something far more dangerous and far more organized.
The crisis evolved both chemically and technologically. It started with opium pills and tinctures. Then, the invention of the hypodermic syringe made morphine faster, more potent. And then came heroin, the ultimate illicit opiate. It was perfect for smuggling, easy to cut with other stuff, and it could generate enormous profits for a new criminal underworld. And it wasn't just opiates. You have to see this. In just 2 years, 2 years between 1904 and 1906, U.S. imports of coca leaves, the raw material for cocaine, went from 53,000 pounds to over 2.5 million. The market for all kinds of mood-altering drugs was just exploding. So who was making money off all this? The source material calls it a mafia complex. And this isn't just about gangsters. It's an entire ecosystem of profiteers. From the overprescribing dope doctors and sketchy pharmacists in the so-called upper world, all the way down to the organized crime gangs and corrupt officials in the underworld. And if you need a perfect, just staggering example of the upper world feeding the underworld, get this. A single doctor in New York City, in 1 month, wrote prescriptions for over 68,000 grains of heroin and 54,000 grains of morphine. That's not a leak from the medical world into the black market. That is a fire hose, creating a massive illegal supply. And with that, the face of addiction completed its transformation. The picture of the respectable, middle-class female user was totally replaced by the stereotype we're much more familiar with today, the lower-class, urban, male criminal. Addiction was successfully shoved out of the mainstream and into the margins, from the upper world straight down to the underworld. And so, there it is. The snake finally bit its own tail. The hunt for profit in the global opium trade, mixed with domestic medical practices and a racist campaign of blame, didn't solve a thing. It created a permanent, criminalized, and uniquely American public health catastrophe that we're still dealing with. Which really leaves us with one last question to think about. We always state the war on drugs to the 1970s, but this history suggests that its foundations, that toxic mix of moral panic, racial scapegoating, and the blurred lines between medicine and crime, all of that was laid down a century earlier. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Are we still just living with the consequences of that original sin?